The passivity of Deleuze and Guattari's vitalism has been associated, often critically and negatively, with capitalism. If Pound's vitalism, and active vitalism more generally, always threatens to fall into a mode of fascism in its elevation of a decision or force outside social circulation, Deleuze and Guattari are wary of the micro-fascisms and the cancerous body without organs that would follow from an insufficiently rigorous political movement of deterritorialization. That is, if the taking up of movements, potentialities, and forces from within capitalism liberates itself from the capitalist axiomatic only to proliferate by turning back in upon the self, the affirmation of one's own especially queer becoming, or the simple affirmation of becoming as such, liberated from all relations, then one has left the grand system of capital without creating a positive line of flight. Queerness defined negatively, as other than any given syntax or system, or as the negation of the ready-made, would be insufficiently vital if one takes vitalism in Deleuze and Guattari's sense as the creation of a body without organs. The imperative is then not a return, retrieval, or revitalization of the already existing synthetic force that has become alienated or reified. Vitality occurs with a line of flight, a becoming, or an event that is not the expression or extension of an already existing force, but the outcome of a genuine and positive encounter. Here we can link Leibniz's passive vitalism to Deleuze and Guattari's concept of becoming animal. For Leibniz, the body's being or individuation is not a consequence of it being synthesized or recognized as this determined being. What something is not defined by the way in which it is recognized, nor by the way in which the being affirms itself. A being is not the being it is because it is recognized as this or that type. A being is individuated by all the relations it bears to other relations. A monad is absolutely unique in its occupation of a point in time and space, as well as the way it perceives and is affected by all the other relations and affections of time and space. Identity does not refer back to the subject who is perceived only through the world it constitutes. On the contrary, Leibniz's world is composed of affections, which expand inward infinitely. A body is its susceptibility to relations, and I am nothing other than the perceptions, events, encounters, and vibrations that produce a certain feeling of oneself or self-enjoyment. For Deleuze, following Leibniz, it is possible to intuit the singularity and difference of the tiny souls of which we are composed, which surround us, and which constitute our individuation. I am those souls I feel as my own, so that we can say that the soul that feels the other souls, the mind that contemplates, exists at a different level, while the feeling I have of the souls that compose me enter into relation with souls from without. I can feel another sadness as their sadness, affecting me in my own being, while not perceiving their world and their duration. One does not become oneself by living as this or that normative being imposed from without, but from which one always differs. Identity is not difference from, nor a negative becoming in which one destabilizes or subverts a given norm. Rather, identity is distinct but unclear. Each being is distinctly individuated by being composed of only its own encounters and affections, and yet one feels certain of those affections clearly, my own sadness, and others dimly, your sadness. This, in turn, has consequences for the politics of images and its problems. It is not a question of either creating images that would be less stringent in their production of norms, or of producing an active, critical, and negative relation to images. On the contrary, micropolitics and schizoanalysis regard any image as ensouled, composed of thousands of affections. Every normative image, such as the mommy-daddy-me of Anti-Oedipus, is not imposed upon an otherwise radically open or undifferentiated life in general. The image does not impose difference on disorder, but covers over distinction with generality. The Oedipal daddy is made up of racial, historical, sexual, and political desires. And it is here we can discern another mode of passive vitalism, one in which forces not of the subject are not taken up and reactivated, but contemplated in their power to destroy subjective syntheses and coherent, as opposed to articulated, identity. Lawrence's prose, often criticized for privatizing or mystifying class politics by presenting social relations in terms of sexuality, can be seen as the creation of just such a socio-political field. The Oedipal triangle, in Sons and Lovers for example, opens out onto a social field. The mother turns her affections to the son precisely because she is disenchanted with the limited education, worn spirit, alcoholism, and resentment of her minor husband. The son, in turn, perceives other women through the figure of his mother, but again in a broadly political field. The cramped and restricted world of his first lover, Miriam, emerges from a desperately declining rural mining milieu, where marriage is the only form of possible social expansion, and where the son sees his mother as similarly folded into a field of historical, social, and class restrictions. The more educated and expansive world of the son's other lover, Clara, is tied to a bourgeois marriage market. But Lawrence is more than a sociological writer who ties the personal and sexual to the political. He also transforms the very style and syntax of literary point of view to create a mode of perception that is neither sexual, in some private and personal psychological sense, nor political, where self-sufficient bodies relate to each other in some community or polis. Similarly, in Lawrence's poem Snake, the observing voice is all too human, feeling himself invaded and overtaken by desires to destroy or master the animal. But alongside the affects of the human, there are also counter-affects that allow the snake to be viewed as noble, stately, more alive than the body of speech and reason. The poem presents a composition of competing perceiving selves in the one speaking body. This fracture is not a negation of the self, but its expansion. Directly thematizing the relation between human and animal, Snake relies not on the fragmented and juxtaposed quotations and allusions of Pound's modernism, but on an encounter between two temporalities or durations expressed at the level of form and content. If active vitalism presents a field of parataxis that must presuppose some absent cause that, as Deleuze and Guattari observe, acts but is not, Lawrence maintains an I viewpoint that is a localization of received impressions and affects. But the I is not only contrasted in terms of content with the snake, it also yields to stylistic poetic variations. According to Deleuze and Guattari, we can distinguish between form of content and form of expression. Not only does this allow us to think about the relations of bodies and the relations of language, it also gives Deleuze and Guattari a way of describing the higher deterritorialization, which occurs when a work of art renders the relation between form of content and form of expression undecidable. Lawrence's poem begins with propositions that describe the snake as a subject completing actions. A snake came to my water trough. The snake is contrasted with the I as observing subject. I came down the steps with my pitcher, and must stand and wait, for there he was at the trough before me. The before me that concludes that lengthy line of verse, a line that itself waits, gives two senses to before. The snake is before me temporally. Its presence forces a sense of another duration. The snake is also before the I spatially. We are given a spatial proximity of two bodies, with an intense temporal distance. The snake is described with adverbs and adverbial phrases: softly, silently, vaguely, dreamily, slowly. The and that frequently begins the poem's lines ties the form of expression to the form of content. Because the observing eye increasingly finds himself captivated by the snake's movement, desire, duration, and milieu, his waiting is expressed not in a syntax of subordinate clauses and consequences, but simple connectives. And I like a second comer waiting, giving us a second coming of the I that is radically counter-messianic. The poem begins to open up the field of the human. To be this highest point of evolution, progress, and rational development is to come second. To be without any existential priority, it is to be belated. Thus, instead of regarding the human, with its expansive point of view, instrumental command of nature, and subjective self-awareness as a point of culmination toward which life is directed, Snake moves in the opposite direction. The snake is one of the lords of life, whose earth is secret. The animal opens onto a time and sense well beyond the eye. The poem describes a waiting where the I arrives at my water trough, only to be dispossessed by an intrusion which is perceived in a double sense. On the one hand, the human milieu regards this animal as an interfering body to be eliminated. Education, action described as paltry, human voices that are petty, myth, and even masculinity pull the I toward command and destruction. And voices in me said, if you were a man, you would take a stick and break him now and finish him off. But on the other hand, another aspect of the I is drawn away from itself toward a fascination with or perception of not the self-awareness and active mastery of the human, but the snake's divinity that lies in a not seeing, in a godliness of being a dream. He drank enough and lifted his head dreamily as one who has drunken, and flickered his tongue like a forked knight on the air, so black, seeming to lick his lips, and looked around like a god unseeing into the air, and slowly turned his head, and slowly, very slowly, as if thrice a dream, proceeded to draw his slow length curving round and climb again the broken bank of my wall face. And as he put his head into that dreadful hole, and as he slowly drew up, snake easing his shoulders and entered farther, a sort of horror, a sort of protest against his withdrawing into that horrid black hole, deliberately going into the blackness, and slowly drawing himself after, overcame me now his back was turned. It is the snake who becomes one of the lords of life, who is like a king in exile, uncrowned in the underworld. The description of the snake as like a king, or as one who seemed like a king, draws attention to the event of encounter as perception. Another duration appears, yet remains, like the snake writhing back into the earth, always hidden, secret. At the level of form of content, the poem takes two bodies, snake and human, with the snake presenting itself as secret, hidden, unself-conscious, and vital, precisely because of its radical passivity, its distinction from the I viewpoint's horror at that which cannot be brought beneath its own command. At the level of form of expression, the poem oscillates between a poetic voice of a reflective I that recognizes itself as a fragment of a history and humanity of domination. I despise myself and the voices of my accursed human education, and another that in its fascination can follow movements, allowing an affect to become the grammatical subject. A sort of horror, a sort of protest against his withdrawing into that horrid black hole, deliberately going into the blackness, and slowly drawing himself after, overcame me now his back was turned. Both at the level of expression, where the grammatical I recognizes its own limits precisely insofar as it is self-aware and human, and at the level of content, where the poem describes the encounter between the time of human history, burdened with myth and education, and the duration of a snake that forces us to wait, Lawrence's poem expresses a passive vitalism that is also positively queer. It is not the critical negation of man, but the intuition of other durations that can open up a genuine event of encounter. This is not an event of recognition, nor of defamiliarization. The inhuman, or the powers of time and movement that do not serve recognition and command, are expressed here as a certain capacity to live the earth not as one's own. The snake's earth is a dark secret, not a matter or ground that we synthesize in order to recognize ourselves as subjects of truth. The I is a second coming in a negative sense, as one who can only perceive from afar what it might be to live without a commanding and educated past, without the imperatives of recognition, if you were a man, while the animal is another style of perception and duration, and one of the lords of life in its liberty for mastery.